literature archives last year, but I will tell you what we know so far. Thanks. The summer of 1927, as I alluded, was not a good time to be in Vienna. Under the newly empowered conservative clerical leaders, the increasingly violent Christian Social Party passed its first piece of legislation. It was an attack on progressive reforms in educational policy. Unlike other educational reformers like Maria Montessori or Rudolf Steiner, both of whom still have private schools in New York, this gap offered Anna Freud and her life companion, Dorothy Tiffany Burlingham, the perfect time to rescue education for psychoanalysis. They made the case that educational reform must, quote, start from the child forward. A school organized according to psychoanalytic principles would succeed for the children only if its founders believed in the child's autonomy. In addition to the child's right to selfhood, this theme would shape all of Anna Freud's future projects, and indeed its influence would spread worldwide. While their school, the Hietzing School, was not a community clinic per se, those would come later, it was one of the analyst's first freestanding endeavors outside the office. This was the Hietzing School. This was 28, the year after it was built. It was a tiny place. You'll see much more about that in the film. This is a kindergarten that still stands from around the same era. And this is the attack on the Palace of Justice in 1927 that was a very dramatic turnaround and fascist attack on the Social Democrats who were in office. The Hietzing School was located in the 13th district of Vienna. The 13th district is called the Hietzing district. It was deliberately non-traditional and under a conceptual umbrella of self-direction and children's rights, the school promoted a broadly humanist education. Later expanded and renamed psychoanalytic pedagogy. This democratic theory aimed for an ideal child-appropriate education targeted to the unique developmental stages, needs, and capacities of children and adolescents. Whether by circumstance or intent, Anna Freud hired teachers who went on to become extraordinary players in the history of psychoanalysis. You will recognize their names. Erik Erikson, then Homburger, for example, was the second teacher, and Peter Bloss was the overall director. Among the local analysts were Kurt Eisler and August Eichhorn, while Hietzing also drew on the international presence in Vienna with teachers like Esther Menaker and Marie Brielle, both from New York. According to student reports, the teachers were well liked, especially because they gave the children confidence in their own research and artistic skills. I have spent most of my life trying to understand children, Anna Freud told Robert Coles in 1970. 50 years earlier, as soon as she gained her official state teaching certificate in 1919, along with the right to vote, Freud began to form her unique research perspective for the emerging field of analytic practice with children. Her method of direct observation yielded developmental information about child-specific needs in education and beyond. From this, she advanced the three areas where she saw psychoanalysis as particularly important to the new pedagogy. These were to, 1, critique existing methods, 2, extend the teacher's knowledge of human beings, and 3, endeavor to repair childhood injuries. So this is Freud, and this is in 1937, and that's Dorothy Tiffany Burlingham. And this is a couple, this was taken in 1979, 3 weeks before Dorothy died, at Berghaus 19 in London. No, not Berghaus 19, I'm sorry. 21 Marisfield Gardens, which is still open but hanging on by a thread. Okay. In contrast to traditional standards that would merely reinforce bourgeois conformity, the analysts wanted, they said, a modern school of our own, where students could develop skills that would promote their personal growth and be useful to society. When they used the word modern, they meant progressive. Later, Anna Freud would remember how she had, quote, hired 2 modern-minded young men as the first teachers. Like her father, she saw how education could reduce social inequality in both theory and practice, because it is a process of learning about oneself and others through personal struggle, hence psychoanalysis and the development of group consciousness. Self-knowledge or insight is what can lead to personal change, and the personal to the social. At the same time, their school would reflect both Red Vienna and the progressive worldview of Dorothy Burlingham's New York family. Next slide, please. I have these 2 quotes from Sigmund Freud, otherwise known as Anna Freud's father. And they reflect in many ways. This is a medal produced by the Social Democrats in 1922. And through this, we start seeing how, really radically progressive Sigmund Freud was also. The kindergarten movement, remember we saw that slide of the kindergarten movement. So the kindergarten movement, as we know it, started in the 19th century, but early childhood education until the 1920s was private and therefore elite. And it was until when Red Vienna organized it as a government service. So it wasn't until the 1920s in Vienna that kindergarten became public. Anna Freud's 1929 lectures for teachers and parents were addressed to the teachers in the new public kindergartens, precisely those who would be vital to the analyst community-based services. Her critique of the old system was piercing. Quote, educators always want to make the child what suits them, which consequently differs according to the century, position, rank, and class of the adults. Or, the universal aim of education is to make out of the child a grown-up who shall not be very different from the grown-up world around him. Or, education struggles with the nature of the child, or as the grown-up usually calls it, his naughtiness. Step by step, she said, education aims at the exact opposite of the child's instinctive drives. She also said that teachers should have learned to know and control their own conflicts before they begin educational work. In other words, knowledge of human beings starts with knowledge of the self, and psychoanalysis helps teachers understand their own development before they can assess a child's with clarity. A democratic society is built on equality, and psychoanalysis postulates that all children are born equal. The most important message is, however, that the unconscious has no social class. We need both freedom and discipline, Sigmund Freud suggested, and it is authoritarianism that inhibits our empathy for others. As he says, strict, quote, strict ethical demands would not do so much harm, he wrote in 1930, if education were to say, this is how we must behave in order to be happy and to make others happy. Sort of resonates with the pursuit of happiness, but Next slide. It was a tall order to be happy and to make others happy. Can education do that? For Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham, there was no pedagogical contradiction between the collectivity at Hietsing and the individualism of child analysis. Since 1924, the year before Dorothy arrived in Vienna, Anna Freud had held a private study group within the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society to examine specifically the relationship between education and psychoanalysis. What came out of this study group were plans for educational counseling centers to be based in the community. After 2 years, the first of these centers opened in a large public school. More of that later. This is Anna Freud's office at Berggasse 19. The apartment, the Freud apartment, is actually made of 2 apartments. It's in a U shape, and this one, these are the photographs by Edmund Engelman, and yeah, there are more of these, but it's quite striking. And this was Chancellor Dollfuss, who was the first Austro-fascist. So this was in 1927, and you can see his gestures replicate what became known as Hitler's fascism. Yeah, so where you saw the fire at the Palace of Justice, he was held, Dollfuss was dressing Heldenplatz, from which Hitler would address the crowds later in 1938. Meanwhile, like the governing Social Democratic Party, the psychoanalysts believed in the future but focused on the present. Marie Yahoda, who's a social psychologist, wrote, "It was not just a promise to be redeemed later, but an activity that encompassed life as a whole in the here and now. The modern housing complexes with rent control, redistributive taxation systems, health and mental health networks, the Social Democrats created a society by and for workers and their families. This was the same momentum that seized child analysis and psychoanalytic pedagogy. What counted was to explore the interplay between school reform, child analysis, and human freedom." But Yahoda also remembered the parallel, darker side of this era. Dollfuss. "So much were we involved in this all-embracing movement that we did not pay enough attention to the wide gulf that separated us from the other side in Austria's deeply split culture until it was too late." Reminiscent, evocative of our world today, maybe. No question that Red Vienna ebbed as Black Vienna, the moniker for Austria's conservative and ever more reactionary sector, grew in strength and violence. If interwar Vienna was red, then Austria was Black, an ideology characterized by rejection of democracy, skepticism of science, and hatred of the Jews. It is a paradox that the University of Vienna, where Sigmund Freud taught, identified with the larger Austria, not Vienna, and with the country's deeply held Catholic conservative beliefs dominated by a coalition of German nationalist parties of the right. By 1932, the medical school was firmly in the hands of the Austro-fascists, and over 80% of the faculty was gone. So too was Hietsing. But the group, next slide, please. But the group of community engaged analysts stayed with the plan. The Jackson Nursery, which was in a room rented from Montessori, which lasted only 1 year, took care of infants and toddlers from very poor families. It is the best known as the home of the new research method. While the Jackson Nursery is indeed quite well known, perhaps because of the American physician Edith Jackson, who funded the project, it was community-based only in its material assistance for poor families, and of course, education and care of small children. But much of the actual community base is less well known today. It focused on services for latency-age children, adolescents, and whole families, and started around 1929. August Eichhorn, Siegfried Ehrenfeld, Willi Hofer, and Anna Freud challenged, at times vehemently, the premises of traditional social institutions, especially schools and the judiciary, which symbolized the reality of repression with which the child engaged outside the family, if the child had one. Interestingly, they also contested some principles which, even today, we think of as progressive. This is a very interesting, this is called the Baby's Buffet. This was then carried much, much further in Anna Freud's projects. In London, they have these, at the Jackson Nursery, these children from extremely poor families. Dorothy called them beyond the doll, right? And they fed the children. And we were, toddlers, infant toddlers. And at first, the children would just absolutely gorge on all the food and then get sick and then wouldn't stop. And especially the chocolate table, like 3 days of gorging on chocolate. And what the researchers found was that bit by bit, this abated. And children they started researching how children develop self-regulation. So you have 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, the baby buffet, and this is where they started documenting self-regulation in toddlerhood. For example, at the school on the Grünentalgasse, in the 9th district, Anna Freud supervised a working collaboration between Montessorian and psychoanalytically oriented primary school teachers, even though the Montessori educational method was starkly different from her own. Montessori saw the teacher's role as a passive one, a background for the child's capacity to concentrate its entirety on a piece of individual work. The sense of release gained by individual problem solving, Montessori believed, would promote development, happiness, and she actually called a spiritual connection with an orderly community, the classroom. In contrast, Anna Freud, with her foundation in depth psychology, sought to promote the child's capacity for self-regulation in a range of activities from eating and hygiene to behaviors, emotions, and relationships, all in a social context. The social context, of course, was broader than the school. So this is the sort of activity and observations you would never find in a Montessori school. Along with Edith Sturba and Fritz Radel, Eichhorn, Hofer, and Anna Freud formed this is a long German word, Erziehung und Jugendliches Beratungsstelle, otherwise known as Educational and Youth Counseling Centers, as a community-based offshoot of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society's Child Guidance Center. This counseling center, the community one, did not meet at the ambulatorium nor at Bergasse 19, but in decentralized schools and community centers around the city from 1926 to 1935. The analysts treated local school children and their families on site or made referrals to specialists if needed. Some of the counseling was targeted to educators, as we've seen, to help them understand their pupils' behavior. It was most important, they believed, to educate the educator, especially the kindergarten and early childhood teachers. The consultations, which were free, and meetings were convened probably monthly in either a large public middle school or an adult education center. Citywide newspaper announcements of Anna Freud's public meetings offer a quick snapshot of her team's approach. These public announcements gave the consultations wide visibility, with about 75 notices of the Beratungsstelle meetings printed in 15 local newspapers. So here you have one, and then, this is like tiny, like a wanted ad. So it reads, Education and Youth Counseling Center of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Education Youth Council of Vienna on Thursday from 6 to 8 o'clock in the Federal High School, Vienna's 10th district, number 10 Gasse. And at the in the parentheses at the end, it's this ghastly Gothic letter, but there's kostenlose Beratung. So that's a free counseling, right? That's the repeat of the same theme. While over 140 daily and weekly newspapers were circulated in the 1920s and early 1930s, sort of the Twitter of the 1920s, it is interesting that those which published these announcements were all of the left. In fact, I have not found a single mention of the anti-Freud in either the centrist or right-wing newspapers. Those were the public announcements, but we also have data from the clinical data from the counseling centers. From 1926 through 1938, the analysts published case material either as clinical illustrations of theory or technique in their new Journal of Psychoanalytic Pedagogy, the Zeitschrift, as it's called. This journal, Anna Freud said, came on with a revolutionary spirit. The journal's editors outlined their goals quite specifically. We will highlight work that has emerged from practice based on experience and observation, they announced. As Rudolf Eckstein saw it, the Zeitschrift was, quote, an effort to replace authoritarian education with a more humane system based on a new psychoanalytic understanding of the child and youth. Much of the data came from community centers. A depressed grandmother is supporting the child whom her son fathered extramaritally. The 8.5-year-old Mina is referred because, quote, no one could cope with her strange personality. She lied, stole, and masturbated openly in the classroom. In an article titled, The Love I Have for Fear, an adolescent boy describes his psychotic experience. Quote, it is like when a cloth is thrown over my head, like when robbers overcome me. I can't get out of there. It can drive you crazy. Now, I'm not sick, but there is a feeling in me that I don't think any other person understands. Unquote. In practice and ideology, the analysts were committed to the idea that children can recover from trauma and saw defenses as pragmatic, if paradoxically unconscious, tools of self-care. Interestingly, social conscience is never far behind the intrapsychic material. In the social democratic city, the analysts were alert to the effects of class. Eichhorn's grandmother is from, he says, a petit bourgeois family where Sturba's Miner was born poor and moved through a sequence of foster homes. Another journal contributor, the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, here again, was among the most radically attuned to the impact of oppression. Reich followed and then uniquely extended Freud's political thought. Like an analysis which frees the individual from inner oppression and releases the flow of natural energy, so Reich believed the political left would free the oppressed and release their innate self-regulating social equanimity. Still under 30 and a member of Sigmund Freud's inner circle, in 1926, Reich published 3 essays in the New Journal. Reich's essays looked specifically at the ways in which both formal education and parental morality reinforce the sense of guilt in the child's emerging sexuality. If adults could understand the consequences of repression, Reich stated, quote, attacking the neurosis by prevention rather than treatment would normalize childhood and improve society at large. Reich, too, held counseling meetings and lectures throughout the city, though his were focused on sexuality. His lectures ranged from the relationship between body and mind at an adult education center to eroticism and education at the Viennese Psychoanalytic. Among today's researchers in the history of psychoanalysis, the community counseling centers are just beginning to be known and understood, but their impact has been enormous. Anna Freud's role was decisive between Eichhorn and Behrenfeld on the one hand, and the next generation, namely Bloss and Erikson, on the other. Her articulation of children's rights in both beyond and before the best interests of the child originated in the emancipatory ethos of Red Vienna. But the impact was not Anna Freud's alone. Somehow the school and the centers attracted a disproportionately high number of early 20th century analysts who drew on their years in Red Vienna to develop later theories of depth and ongoing influence. They remained colleagues, friends, and mentors in exile after the mid-30s, and each one gained from the others to investigate new pathways for reaching troubled children. Peter Bloss, for example, drew on Eichhorn, Anna Freud, and Erikson for his 1962 On Adolescence. And Erikson himself, the Pulitzer Prize winner who pushed the central concept of the social environment's influence on human development, taught and trained at Hitzing. And as Wilhelm Reich, who coined the term the sexual revolution, which became a banner rubric for the 1960s, it was Wilhelm Reich, a metaphor of not just sexual, but liberation of the mind and body from authoritarian repression in its broadest meaning. And so we have some here, my idea of the immediacy of the people working in Red Vienna, the analysts working in Red Vienna, working at the Hitzing School, and how they took this ideology worldwide. And even today, we still have the Alliance for Psychoanalytic Schools, developed in large part by, influenced by Marie Brielle. And so this is just some of it, Finally, the final section of our work today, we will be showing our new documentary. I think the next slide is just the cover. Yes. Anna Freud and the Conscience of Society. This started as the digital version of a 2017 Freud Museum London exhibit, but one rendered on a more intimate scale. The film was funded by the Austrian Cultural Forum Budapest, made on a very modest budget, and it premiered in Budapest in 2018 at a conference marking the centennial of Freud's celebrated paper on, well, the conscience of society. The script is drawn almost entirely from the writings of Anna Freud and Dorothy Tiffany Burlingham and their colleagues. The voiceover by Inga Pretorius as Anna Freud is sustained with an original composition by the British composer inspired by the American composer Matthew Greenbaum from Brooklyn. The film was designed by Carolina Urbania at her studio in North London. The context is broader than Anna Freud's reminiscences, her personal and professional friendships, or even the psychology of her passion for child emancipation. It's the very historical shift from the time when Anna was 22 in 1918 to the end of Vienna as she knew it in 1934 and later in London in the 1940s. To dramatize Anna Freud's reminiscences on screen required a huge number of images. There are over 400 photographs here. Some were first seen at the exhibit, others were collected for the book, and many more came from scavenging through old feuilleton postcards at the flea markets in Vienna. Taken together, the images powerfully dramatize the effect of culture and politics on a person's life. Or perhaps it's the other way around. The power of a singular person to affect the culture and beliefs of an entire era. And with this, we now show the present film.
I will never forget that autumn day in Budapest, when I was 23 years old and we all sat under a walnut tree in the garden of one of those wonderful restaurants, chatting confidentially and privately around a big table.